Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Denham, Chair of Linguistics here at Western, and I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Virginia Dawson and to welcome her as the Winter Quarter invited speaker in the Western Washington University Department of Linguistics lecture series. Professor Dawson is an assistant professor in the Linguistics Department here at Western, and her research centers on semantics, pragmatics, and language documentation with a primary focus on Tiwa, a Tibeto-Burman language of Northeast India. She received her doctorate in linguistics from the University of California, Berkeley in 2020. So in Professor Dawson's talk today, she'll provide a description of Tiwa kinship terminology and its interface with Tiwa cultural practices, and she'll highlight one way in which the study of kinship terminology in Tiwa has consequences for semantic theory more generally. So we'll have time at the end for questions, so feel free to use the chat and send those privately to me during the talk, or to save them to the end when we'll have a traditional raise your hand Q&A, right? So without further ado, I will turn it over to Ginny.
Thanks, Kristen. So I have to start screen sharing, but I also want to sorry, let me do that and arrange you so I can see you all very awkwardly. I want to put in the chat as well. These are the slides. So if anyone would like to access the slides, you can go ahead and click on them. Because I'm going to be jumping around a lot, and you may want to go back and look at a particular slide if you have a question about it or anything like that. Okay, so, oops, one more thing I have to do. Great, so as Kristen said, I'll be talking about kin in Tiwa today. So I want to start with kind of a really obvious fact, which is that languages provide ways of talking about who's related to who. In other words, kinship. So it's part of our knowledge as speakers of English that we know that we refer to our mother and father as mom and dad, and our parent siblings with terms like aunt and uncle. And if you're a monolingual English speaker, this may seem kind of self-evident to you, but languages actually differ substantially in how they encode kinship relationships. So this is just an example from Savo-Savo, a Papuan language of the Solomon Islands. I could have pulled almost any language to demonstrate the same point. But in Savo-Savo, the term mama is not just used to refer to someone's mother, but to their mother and their aunts as well. The term mau is used to refer to father, but also father's brothers. And there is a distinct term kulaga, which is used only to refer to your mother's brothers. So it's like uncle, but more specific than that. And so we see this kind of cross-linguistic variation in pretty radical ways in the kinship terminology. So in this talk, we will be looking at kinship terminology in Tiwa, which is a Tibeto-Burman language that's spoken in Northeast India. And this is part of a larger ongoing documentation project that I've been undertaking since about 2012. And before we dive into the kinship system, I want to highlight just a couple of bigger themes that I'm hoping to kind of draw out as we discuss Tiwa kinship. The first has to do with kinship and grammar. And the claim I'm going to make is that kinship terminology is intertwined with grammar in really important ways. And this has consequences for adequate documentation and description of grammatical systems. So we can't just say that kinship terms are just something that should go in a dictionary. We have to reference them directly when we're discussing like grammar, including pragmatics, but also things like how you put numerals with nouns, as we'll see. The second bigger theme has to do with kind of formal linguistic theory. And so what I'm hoping to show today is that kinship terminology has the potential to shed light on really seemingly unrelated theoretical debates in things like formal semantics. And I think this is important because, you know, kinship terminology has traditionally been the realm of anthropological linguists and lexicographers. But I think as linguists, we should all be concerned with it because it's a really exciting kind of semantic domain. And the kind of way I've phrased this here is that even formal semanticists like me should be paying attention to kinship terminology. Okay, so with that in mind, here is a quick roadmap of how the talk is going to go. I am going to provide some background on Tiwa and the methodology I used to do this research. I will then give you a description of some of the kinship system, most of it really, but I could not fit it all in this talk, unfortunately. We'll then transition into talking about what I call group kin terms in Tiwa. And then we'll talk about the implications for semantic theory that those group kin terms have. Okay, so to dive into it. Tiwa, as I said, is a Tibeto-Burman language. It's spoken in Assam and Meghalaya states in Northeast India. I'll show you on a map in a second. It's a member of the Boro-Garo subgroup of Tibeto-Burman, and in 2011, it had approximately 34,000 speakers. Speakers of all ages. That number is presumably larger now because it's been 10 years. Okay, so here is a map of India on the left. Northeast India is the part of India that like loops over the top of Bangladesh. And if we see on the right, we zoom in, Tiwa is spoken inside this red circle here. Sorry, I hope you can see my cursor there. So kind of right in the middle of Northeast India. Okay, so there is some existing documentation of the Tiwa's kinship system. In particular, the individual terms, like all the terms I'm going to be discussing today, are listed in this dictionary, which was compiled by U.V. Joseph in 2014. As you can see, it's very extensive. It's a great dictionary. So this gives a definition for each of the terms, but it doesn't present them in the kind of bigger system or talk about how they interface with the grammar at all. There is some partial description of the system by Ramirez and Bouchery and Longmailai in kind of bigger works. So Ramirez's book he's an anthropologist. It's about various anthropological topics in Northeast India. Kinship is one of them, and he talks a little bit about Tiwa. And Bouchery and Longmailai wrote an article describing the kinship system of Dimasa, which is a related language. So both these works reference the Tiwa kinship system, but only in a partial way. They only talk about like uncle and aunt terminology, but as we're going to see, there is a lot more to be said when you look at the broader system. And so the purpose of this study is to complete the systematic description, so the work that started by Ramirez and Bouchery and Longmailai, and to examine the kinship's interface with pragmatics and other areas of grammar. So kind of talking about this link between this particular lexical domain and the kind of bigger grammar of the language. Okay, so all the data I collected, I'm presenting to you today, I collected across 4 field trips between 2015 and 2018. So the data mostly comes from targeted interviews with 3 main teachers where we sat down and talked at great length about the kinship system and went through systematically. These interviews were supplemented by just my observation of kinship address terms among the community during my time there. So like seeing how people refer to each other. And of course, those observations led into more questions during the interviews. So I was able to get more details that way. They also kind of informing the interview questions was just my experience as a language learner of Tiwa during my time there. So very early on, my teachers decided that I was their sister, and I was then expected to learn how to refer to everyone else based on that particular kinship relationship, which I think is how I mostly got interested in this domain. So obviously trial and error was a large part of this, but those experiences also led me to ask more questions in the targeted interviews. Okay, so these are my teachers. We have Mary Maslay on the left and Bibiana and Juliana Maslay on the right. And obviously all of this work would have been impossible without them and without their language expertise and fantastic commentary on the system. Here is a snapshot of one of my notebooks, just so you can get a sense of me scrolling down kinship terms and comments and kind of ethnographic notes as we went and kind of going through very systematically to work out how to refer to literally everyone. Okay, so Tiwa's kinship system. Let's dig into it. So I'm going to start by showing you this diagram. If you've ever looked at like a genealogical family tree, keep that in mind, because this is basically the same thing, right? It's the easiest way to read these things. So in particular, we have the ego in the middle. So this is the person that the kinship terms are defined relative to. So it's probably helpful to just imagine that that's you when you look at these diagrams. We then have the horizontal lines here, like these ones. Wait, can you see my cursor? Okay, good. Whoops, sorry. These horizontal lines represent a marriage relationship. So these two people are married. Oh, sorry. And then we have the vertical lines representing descent. So these are the parents of the ego. And then we have this kind of up and down structure representing siblings, so the same generation. As you can see on the left, I'm following the standard practice of using a circle to represent females and a triangle to represent male reference in the tree. So this is Tiwa's immediate family. I've got immediate in scare quotes there, of course, but from looking at this, we can see a couple of patterns or like distinctions that are made show up. So we can begin to get a handle on the system. The first thing to notice is that generation is encoded. This is exactly the same as English. This is not surprising, right? So we have a difference between daughter and son, and mother and father, and grandmother and grandfather, which is the same on both sides, and grandchildren. We also have a distinction of gender as well. So there are different terms for the most part for a male referent and a female referent that's related in a particular way to the ego. So mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, son, daughter. This distinction collapses in certain domains, so grandchildren, and we'll see a couple of other places where the gender is not marked. There's also a distinction of age among siblings. So this is different from English, but if you were a speaker of Japanese, it will be familiar to you. So in particular, there's no single word for brother or sister. Instead, you have to specify whether it's your younger sister, nanao, your younger brother, kojal, your older sister, pai, or your older brother, kai. So this is kind of age among siblings being directly encoded through the lexical items. And we're going to see this popping up again in a big way. Okay, the final distinction to note here is what's called a consanguinal versus a phenyl distinction. These are just fancy ways of saying blood relatives versus relatives by marriage. So we can see this in the tree in the following way. We have a term for daughter, sajo, and a term for son, sa. There is a different term for son-in-law, so someone who's married to my daughter, and daughter-in-law, someone who's married to my son. In English, we kind of mark this, of course, by suffixing in-law to any other kin term, but we'll see in Tiwa that it's a much kind of more articulated distinction. Okay, so hopefully you're comfortable looking at these diagrams because we're going to see some more. And as we begin to look beyond the immediate family, things start to get even more complicated. I mean, so far it looks similar to English with the older brother, younger brother thing. But when we look beyond the immediate family, we see we have a distinction of in-clan versus out-of-clan. I'll explain what that means in a sec. We have fine-grained distinctions among the phenyl or in-law relations. And we're going to see that the gender of the ego actually comes into play when defining kinship terms. So your gender would determine how different kinship terminology is decided. But before we get into this, we need some background on Tiwa society and familial structure first. So Tiwa society is divided into approximately 28 distinct kul, and this is usually translated as clan. So each Tiwa is a member of exactly one kul, and this kul is inherited from one of their parents. It could be mother or father, that depends on circumstance. I am happy to talk about that more in the question period if you're interested in that. And you can think about kul as kind of being like your last name. So, in a lot of societies, you only inherit your last name from one of your parents. So you can think of it in that way. And kul is really essential for a lot of kind of Tiwa society things. First, it determines your marriageability. Specifically, marriage within a kul is strictly prohibited, regardless of whether or not you're actually related to the person. So obviously these kul have thousands and thousands of members, but you cannot marry anyone, even if they're like your millionth cousin. It's strictly prohibited. But it's also really important for determining kinship terminology, which is why I'm bringing it up in the first place, right? There's going to be different kinship terms for relatives within your kul and those who are outside of your kul. Okay, so let's look at this in the aunt and uncle domain. So as I said, you inherit your kul from one of your parents. So that's this diagram on the left. This is your in-clan parent. And we're going to talk about terminology here to refer to that parent's sibling. So these are some of your aunts and uncles, right? And what you'll notice here is that there is a term mamai that's used to refer to your in-clan parents' brothers. And then there is a distinct term asi to refer to your in-clan parents' younger sister. And ayong is used to refer to your in-clan parents' older sister. So we see the age among siblings showing up here again relative to your parent, right? At least partially. If we look at the out of clan parent, so these would be the parent who doesn't have the same last name as you, we see a different set of terminology. In particular, the word ani is used to refer to your out of clan parent sisters, but this time age doesn't matter. The word tadai is used to refer to your out-of-clan parent's younger brother, and ayong, which is the same term as over here, is used to refer to your out-of-clan parent's older brother. So we see this term ayong is gender neutral. It's being used to refer to an older sibling, and which gendered sibling depends on whether that parent is in your clan or out of your clan. So, distinct set of terminology, in clan versus out of clan. The system gets more complicated when we look at how you refer to your aunts and uncles by marriage, right? So this is in a phenyl relationship. So here is a more complicated slide where I've added in the marriage relationships. Some really interesting stuff happens. So when I'm talking about my in-clan parents, my in-clan uncle, my mamai, I would refer to his wife as Ani. And that Ani, that's that term for your out-of-clan parents' aunt, right? And you see the flip side on that other side. So you would refer to an Ani's husband as mamai. So this person might not be related to you, this mamai, in any way, but this like degree of separation brings it back around to referring with the same term. And the way the system works is that anis and mamais are always married to each other. And then you can have mamais that are blood relatives and anis that are blood relatives, but then their spouse will obviously not be. Well, I don't think, they don't have to be a blood relative. Okay, another thing to note is that ayongs are always married to ayongs here. So this is, again, it's a gender neutral term. So it's just used to like categorize this older than in a certain way. What's really interesting is that this term ayong also refers to great grandparents and great grandchildren. So there's something about this, like, I think 3 generations out that's also used for this particular kind of uncle and aunt. I have no idea what the linking conceptual thing is there, if there is some kind of semantic core. It's still something I'm thinking about, so if you have suggestions, I'd be very interested. And then, so Tadais are married to Assis, which is the same term that was over here. There is, for some reason, a completely unique term to refer to the husband of your in-clan aunt's, your in-clan parent's younger sister. So this is like one particular kind of uncle by marriage. I don't know why this is a distinct term. It doesn't seem to be culturally relevant in any particular way. In fact, mamais are really the important cultural uncles. So that is a bit of a mystery to me, but there is that distinct term for asa versus tadai. Okay, that's aunts and uncles. So the next thing I want to talk about is cousins. And you may be thinking, okay, there's going to be a lot of terms for cousins too, probably based on which kind of uncle and aunt they are related to you via. That is not the case though. Cousins are just referred to as siblings. So it's exactly the same set of terminology we saw on the immediate family slide earlier, where we have younger sister, younger brother, nanau kojal, and older sister, older brother, pai kai. So cousins, no matter what clan they're from, if they're just your cousins, then they're the same as your siblings. So we see this kind of collapsing of the category on that generational level. And this generational contrast, the like hyper-articulated uncle and aunt terminology and hyper-unarticulated cousin and sibling terminology, this is typical of Northeast Indian languages, it seems, but highly unusual in a global context. And so that is something I'm happy to talk about more in the question period as well, how this fits in with the typologies. But this is something that hasn't really made it into like the traditional way of talking about kinship systems across languages. All right, so that was uncles and aunts and cousins / siblings, which are the same. There are a lot more phenyl relationships to talk about. So these are, again, people that are related to you via marriage. In English, we just stick in-law onto the end. So these are all your in-laws, right? And what we're going to see is there's a distinction between spouses of relatives. So those are people you are related to, their spouses have one set of terminology. And then relatives of your spouses, of your spouse, sorry. We're going to see what this means in a second in more detail. We're also going to see the gender of the ego showing up as relevant in this domain of kinship. So let's start with your siblings' spouses. So this is you. These are your brothers and sisters. And then these highlighted ones are the people who are married to your brothers and sisters. So of course, we refer to these in English as brothers and sisters-in-law. In Tiwa, you can see that there is a distinction again based on relative age among siblings. So there's a distinct term for the wife of your brother, pauji, a distinct term for the wife of your older sister, sorry, the husband of your older sister, punsi. The wife of your younger brother is pohari. And then you'll see that there are two terms here for the husband of your younger sister. And the choice between these two terms depends on the gender of the ego. So as a woman, people would describe this person, the husband of my younger sister, as my chawai, and I would call him my chawai. If I were a man, people would describe that particular relative, my younger sister's husband, as my kabi, and I would refer to him as kabi. So this is one way in which, so we see there's clearly a gender distinction based on like who we're referring to, but there's also this gender distinction based on who the ego is. So there's kind of multiple ways of encoding this. Just as a side note, it took me a long time to realize there was this word kabi and similar ones because of the methodology, of course. I was looking at how I would refer to everyone. And so it took me a couple of years to work out that there were these other terms that I would have used if I were a man. So it's an interesting methodological note there. Oh, another thing is that pohari, you probably don't remember this from a much earlier slide. This term also refers to daughter-in-law. So my younger brother's wife is the same as my daughter-in-law. So I think that this just says it's a kind of wife of my younger male relative. I think is the kind of key thing there. Okay, so that is my siblings' spouses, people who have married my siblings. There is a distinct set of terminology for my spouse's siblings. So these are the brothers and sisters of the person I'm married to. In English, we refer to everyone as brothers and sisters-in-law. So this can take a minute to get your head around, but it makes sense to have a different set of terminology. People that married into your family, and then the family that you married into. That's conceptually distinct, right? And so here we can see this is you or me, this is our spouse, and then there is this term sali, which is also gender neutral, that refers to the younger siblings of my spouse. There is a distinct term to refer to my spouse's older sister, and a distinct term to refer to my spouse's older brother. Again, we see the gender of the ego coming into play here. So woman refers to that person as chotal, and a male would refer to him as chelarao. Okay, you can see why I became kind of obsessed with working this out. When people were like, no, you don't refer to that person like that. And I was like, hang on. One final brother and sister-in-law term is the term Saru. So this term is used to refer to anyone who is married to a set of siblings, right? So like they are the spouses of my spouse's siblings' spouses. Sorry, I'm really tripping over this. It's not easy to say in English. So say I marry someone and someone else marries my spouse's sibling. We refer to each other. We're like kind of married into this family. We would refer to each other as Saru. That's gender neutral term. Doesn't matter about like age distinctions. We are all just kind of like people that married into this particular set of siblings. So they are Saru. Okay, so that's the final brother and sister-in-law term. So you can see kind of degrees and ways of being related by marriage really makes a difference here. It's not just the kind of in-law relation we're familiar with from English. Okay, so what about mother and father-in-law? I've just talked about the siblings here. There are, again, distinct terms to refer to mother and father-in-law. So just remembering back to the immediate family slide, mother was ma, father was papa. I refer to my mother-in-law with the term niu, and my father-in-law with the term hu. So again, like just completely distinct lexical items here. These terms actually extend, though, to my spouse's uncles and aunts. So my mother-in-law and my aunt-in-law are all the same. And my mother-in-law and the uncles who are out of clan are referred to as the same. There is, however, a distinct uncle-in-law term that is used for my spouse's in-clan parent. In-clan uncles. So these are mamais. My spouse's mamais, this particular kind of uncle, would get a special term, a special in-law term. So if I'm a woman, it's my mamahur, but if I'm a man, it's my hu mamai, which is literally morphologically father-in-law plus mamai. So father-in-law, uncle term. So that one can be broken down. Okay, so I've just run us through a lot of terminology. I know it was a lot. That's why I put the slides in the chat so you can go and look at them. Hopefully the diagrams made sense, because I think that's the best way to visualize this as an actual system, right? I would briefly now like to talk, though, about the way kinship interacts with pragmatics, with one particular aspect of the grammar of Tiwa. So Tiwa has exactly two kinds of what I'm calling here reciprocal politeness respect relationships. So what all this means is that somebody like I, as the ego, am in a respect relationship with certain family members of mine, and it's reciprocal. So they're in a respect relationship with me. It goes both ways. And there are two kinds of relationships that people talk about. One is the parent-in-law and child-in-law relationship. And I said parent-in-law plus because it's also uncles and aunts-in-law and nephews and nieces-in-law. So all the news and who's we saw on the previous slide. So parents-in-law have to be respectful to their children-in-law and vice versa. There's also this respect relationship between the spouse of an older sibling and a younger sibling's spouse. So this is a very specific relationship, and it also has that reciprocity built into it. So it's easier to see this with the diagrams, but say I am this ego, I have to respect my younger siblings' spouses, so Chawai and Pohari. They would be this ego, and they have to respect their spouse's older sibling. So that would be me, the Nanisha, in that case. So this is a reciprocal relationship, but it's based entirely on age as well. So the reverse relationship doesn't hold. Salis do not have to respect Punsis and Paujis. It's only in this particular direction. Okay, so politeness relationships obviously come with a whole bunch of sociocultural stuff and just, cultural practice, right? The reason I'm bringing it up, though, is because it has linguistic reflexes. In particular, it has two, and they're both to do with plurality. So an ego, when they're like you or whoever, when they're referring to this particular kin that they're in a politeness respect relationship with, they have to use plural pronouns. This is both in the third person when I'm talking about them to someone else, but also second person when I'm addressing them directly. The ego also has to, when they're talking about these particular kin, modify the kin term that they're using with the associative plural marker. So just a side note on what an associative plural marker is. This is a special kind of plural marking that many languages have that's usually attached to something like a proper name. And what it denotes is it kind of takes all the textually relevant people associated with the proper name. So I've got an example here on one. Mary Chogol Dipu Jingliga. This means Mary and company with this associative plural marker went to Difu. So it's not a traditional plural marker. It's not saying the Marys went to Difu. It's saying Mary and her buddies or whoever. So we can see this coming up in the politeness talk. If I am talking about my mother-in-law, and I'm saying my mother-in-law is having a lot of trouble, I would have to say, I knew chogol kupsasti tongo, where I am, because I am in the politeness relationship with her, I have to add the associative plural marker to the kinship term, even though I'm just referring to her. I'm not referring to the people associated with her. If I wanted to follow up and say she's still unwell, I would have to use the plural, third person plural pronoun, pibur shaitaido. So that's like saying they are still sick. It would be considered rude and infelicitous to use the regular third person singular pronoun. And so in this context, right, it's only her that's sick. It's not her and the people associated with her. So this is not literally plural marking, but it's used pragmatically to indicate respect and politeness. And of course, this is something that's not unique to Tiwa. Using plural forms as respect or politeness forms is something that's very common cross-linguistically. So in particular in European languages, this is done all the time, or at least historically. That's where the plural forms come from, usually. I mean, the polite forms of pronouns. So it's interesting to see it pop up here as well. A bigger point I'd like to make at this point, though, is that these politeness strategies, this use of plural marking, is not used beyond these specific kin relationships. So it's different from like European polite versus impolite pronouns, right? It's not just used to indicate respect, like with a teacher or whoever. It's only used in these reciprocal kinship relationships. And so this means that when we describe this, when we talk about the grammar of pragmatics, right, like the pragmatic resources a language uses, we have to directly reference kinship, right? We have to talk about kinship and the structure of kinship in order to capture this. And so any adequate grammatical description has to as well, right? So if you're writing a grammar of this language, then you have to make reference to the kinship in order to include this information. And of course, this becomes even more important if it's a pedagogical grammar that's intended to teach people how to speak the language, because this pragmatic information, this pragmatic grammar, is obviously very important. So this is one of the ways that grammar and kinship interact. Okay, I'm also keeping an eye on the time here. Sorry, I'm throwing a lot at you. There's a lot of kinship terminology to talk about. For the rest of the talk, I would like us to focus on these group kin terms that I alluded to in the introduction. So far, all the terminology we've been talking about just refers to a single individual, right? Like somebody's mother or their brother-in-law of whatever kind, right? It's just like a single individual. Tiwa also has a series of words, inherently plural nouns, that refer to groups of people that are in a particular kinship relationship with each other. So here's an example of what I mean by that. I can say in Tiwa something like Wapala Samago Lakmangang. This roughly translates as, I met the pair of people in a parent-child relationship who sold the pigs, right? And so this blue translation here, this information is all contained in this Tiwa word sama, which I've glossed as parent plus child. And so, yeah, what this term is, it's inherently plural, and it's referring to that group of people who among themselves have this relationship, right? Parent and child. So Tiwa has a lot of these terms. There's sama, but there's also the more specific saba, which is fathers and sons specifically in a group that you could describe. There's a word for couples, like married couples. There's a word for siblings, tohari. This is probably the closest one we have in English, right? Like you could refer to that group of people as siblings, right? There's also a word for co-siblings-in-law. So earlier I had this Saru term. It's like people who have married into the same sibling set. So if you saw that group of people who married into the same sibling set, you could refer to that group as to Saru, which would be like co-siblings-in-law. There are terms for mamais and their nephews and nieces. There's also terms for various combinations of brothers-in-law and sisters-in-law, and a man and his wife's mamai, his wife's uncle. So these are highly specific, right? And this is an exhaustive list. This is all 10 of these words. So it's not every possible combination, it's these highly specific combinations of people. So there are particular words to refer to these sets. These words are super interesting. They are similar to a set of group kin terms that are found in the Yi languages, as described by Bradley in 2001. This is a distantly related subgroup of Tibeto-Burman that's spoken in southern China. And the group kinship terms seem to be very similar in their form and their function, though they differ in the exact categories they're encoding. Obviously, cultures are different, so you're going to encode different sets of kin. As far as I know, though, such terms haven't been described in other Tibeto-Burman languages. So this has been something that's talked about as unique to the Yi languages, so it's perhaps surprising to find it. in such a distantly related kind of Tibeto-Burman language that's also very far in terms of geography and in culture, right? So if you know anything about these terms elsewhere, I'm still learning about them, so please tell me if you do, because especially in an Indian context, it'd be very helpful. Okay, but my last point is that these group kin terms have some really exciting implications for the semantics of accountability. And so this, of course, is the other part of my research, semantic theory, and this is kind of the connecting point I would like to make. To make this point, though, we have to go on a brief detour into another area of Tiwa. So Tiwa, like many languages, is a numeral classifier language, which means that nouns are not directly modified by numerals. Instead, they require a classifier, otherwise known as a measure word. And so this is familiar from Chinese, Japanese, many languages are like this. So you can't just say 3 women in Tiwa, tin margi. You have to add this classifier in between in order to count nouns. So there's a long-standing debate in formal semantics about what classifiers actually do. And like, why do some languages have classifiers and other languages don't? So how can we explain this? So one theory says that classifiers are required in some languages because of the noun meanings in those languages. The other main theory says that classifiers are required in some languages because of the numeral meanings in those languages. So I'll explain what I mean by this. On the first theory, the classifiers are for noun theory, the idea would be that an English noun like women has something like a measure phrase built into it. The noun women tells you how the women should be counted. And then you can just add the numeral, because all that information is already in the noun. And this theory says that nouns in classifier languages don't have this information built into the noun. Instead, it has to be added with the classifier, right? So women doesn't tell you how to count women, so you have to add this classifier, which then explains to the numeral how to count. The other theory just flips it around. It says, no, no, no. It's the numerals that have this information built into them, right? So 3 tells you how to count. It's like an abstract number plus this measure phrase. But in numeral classifier languages, numerals are just the abstract number. And you have to add the classifier to tell you how to use that abstract number to count things, right? So on the first theory, the classifier is modifying like the noun meaning. So the classifier plus noun is like the unit. In this second theory, it's the classifier and the numeral. So Bale and Coon present an argument from Mi'kmaq, the Canadian language, in favor of the second approach. And it's kind of a cool argument. In particular, what they show is that Mi'kmaq numerals, only some of them require classifiers, but others don't. So if you look at this, the way you say 6 men in Mi'kmaq, you've got the word 6, you have to add this classifier in order to have it modify man. You can't directly put them together. So this is like Tiwa, right? But if I use a different numeral, if I use the numeral 5, I can put them together. In fact, I can't use the classifier. So what Mi'kmaq seems to be saying or showing us is that the numeral 5 already has the measure phrase built into it, right? So that's why it's able to directly count man. The numeral 6 lacks this measure phrase built into it. Maybe it's just the abstract number, and the classifier has to be added. And because man is the same in both these sentences, it's not the noun. Like, the noun doesn't matter. It's really about the numeral semantics. So a really cool thing that Tiwa kinship terminology shows us is that the opposite can also be true. The opposite can also be true. Tiwa presents the exact parallel argument for the other option. In particular, group kin terms in Tiwa can be modified by numerals directly. So I can say in Tiwa 3 sama or tin sama, where I'm just putting 3 directly with this group kin term. In fact, if you try and put a classifier there, it becomes bad. It becomes ungrammatical. In contrast, if you just take a non-group kin term, you cannot do this, right? So the word son here, you can't just put it directly with 3 to say 3 sons. You have to you have to modify it with the classifier in order to count. And so what this is showing is that it's not about the numeral in Tiwa, right? Tin is the same. It's about the noun here. So the classifier seems to be really there because of what the noun means, not because of what the numeral means. So the Tiwa facts here show that the picture is more complicated than previously thought. Classifiers in Tiwa seem to modify noun meaning, but in Mi'kmaq, they seem to modify the numeral meaning, which is kind of cool, right? And this has some potential bigger implications. Specifically, well, I think that it shows that classifiers are not an invariant class across languages. They are like doing different things. But it also potentially shows that there is cross-linguistic variation in where measure phrases are built in. Perhaps they are built in the nouns in Tiwa, but in the numerals in Mi'kmaq, which would be kind of cool. But to bring it back to the other bigger point, group kin terms are the only nouns in Tiwa that can be directly modified by numerals. And without doing this detailed investigation of the kinship system, this counterpoint could not have been made, right? So this kind of like in-depth lexical work into this kinship system lexical domain kind of reveals much bigger points about the language, even beyond just kinship theory, right? So these like bigger structural theoretical questions as well in seemingly unrelated domains. Okay, so very quickly, just to wrap up, kinship interacts with grammar, and adequate grammatical description has to deal with kinship systems rather than leaving it solely to the lexicographers who write great dictionaries and to ethnographic descriptions. Okay, that is all. Sorry I went over.
No, it's perfect. Thank you, Jenny. Super interesting. So let's open it up now to questions. If you all would like to put your cameras on so Jenny can see some faces, that would be great. If you'd like. And also, I do have a question or two that came through in the chat, but feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question. I think our group is small enough that will work fine. Professor Mata has a question. Go right ahead.
Hi, Jeannie. Thank you for your talk. Very, very interesting. I especially enjoyed the part at the end with the classifiers because it makes me think of my research with Bantu. But I wanted to start with a really maybe straightforward, easy question, which is if you have seen or if you have any data for the connection between the complicated system of kinship terms and acquisition.
No, I don't. I have no data on acquisition at all. I've never worked with kids, but you could easily get it in Tiwa. I mean, all the kids are monolingual in Tiwa until they reach school age, and then they learn English and Assamese. So that would be something that would be very easy to look into, but not something I have done. But yeah, it would be really interesting to see how the acquisition happens. Okay, thank you. And anecdotally, do you have any maybe any idea of what an L1 versus an L2 learner or I'm not even sure if L2 actually applies for these kinds of languages. It does for me. Okay, right. No, there's a couple of L2 learners. People who marry into Tiwa families have to learn Tiwa. But yeah, just in my own experience, it's way easier to learn the immediate family terminology it's the uncle and aunt system that is like really hard because of the flip-flop with the married terms as well.
Right.
But obviously this is anecdotal.
Okay. Yeah, cheers. Thank you. Thanks so much. Great presentation. Thank you.
All right, Professor Xing, you're up next. Jenna, go ahead.
Hi, this wonderful talk. It's fascinating. It sounds like a maze when you look at the data. I think that I can see why you're interested in it, because I assume Tiwa is also isolating language. Does it have a logographic writing system?
What do you mean by that? Sorry.
The writing form is
alphabetical. Oh, the writing. Sorry, I think the audio cut out.
I'm sorry.
No, so the writing system, it wasn't written until relatively recently, and so now it has a Romanized writing script. But it's not actually isolating. It's actually an agglutinating language. So it looks a lot like Turkish and other really agglutinating languages.
Very interesting, because when you say all this, you mentioned that there's no gender marking, and so it's all on the lexicon. But when I look at your gloss, it shows that it has some sort of a case marking, and here and there is also shows some sort of number marking. Is the number marking consistent on all nouns or not?
Yeah, okay, the number marking system is very interesting. There is, in addition to the associative plural marker, regular plural markers, and they are always optional, but they can be used on any noun. So it's different from like Mandarin, where mun can only be used on like humans, I think.
Yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh no, so this is also a very interesting fact. Sorry, I'm on a random slide here. I was trying to get back to the other one. But yes, it is a surprising fact from a typological perspective. I mean, people have, of course, claimed that classifier languages don't really have plural marking, but I think Tiwa is an example that shows that they do.
Yeah, that's what I'm leading to, because according to Greenberg, the universal grammar, if you have for languages that have a classifier system, you don't have a number marking. And so that's why it's so interesting when you say, when you have this kinship terms that like a group, and you don't need a classifier, but if it's a singular, and you do need, of course, the classifier traditionally, or in the prototypical sense, it's modify singular nouns, and to provide semantic functions, or share some sort of a semantic functions as what the noun, or helping people to understand what the noun is. That's what classifiers' primary function. So that's why you have this asymmetrical kind of a marking for the, I would tend to think for those group kind of kinship terms, you don't need a classifier. But for the singular kinship terms, you do. Is that
right.
Cross-board the same?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So there's something about the inherent pluralness, which means you don't need that classifier there. Yeah, that's something I hadn't thought about, but it's definitely like a good clue. I'm still working on the analysis of these, obviously.
It's all the classifier in Chinese, they are we call it a singularity classifier. There's only one plural classifier. Because certainly in Chinese sense, most of the classifiers, we only have a nominal classifier. We don't have, say, the predicate type verbal classifier as some of the Aboriginal languages in Southeast Asia there. But I thought that that's a nice correlation between number and the classifier system. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that.
up is Graham and Jess, or Graham or Jess, or Jess or Graham.
And
we each.
I was wondering if there are any relevant terms for twins or triplets or that kind of relationship, especially with the ego or otherwise.
Whoa, I don't know. That's a great question. I will look in this dictionary because it will have the word if there is one. Because you would imagine that would also be one where you can directly modify it, right? Thanks for that. That's an awesome question.
Yeah, thank you.
And then my question is, was there any, well, I'm just curious about the directionality for the age on the diagrams and why, if there was a reason for why older was on the right, because I was thinking my natural interest would be to do it on the left. So was that just how you did it, or is there a specific reason?
That's so interesting because someone else had that reaction to my diagrams the other day. And I was like, well, obviously it's on the right, but obviously it's not obvious. I think it's standard, but now I'm beginning to doubt because I feel like in most of the kind of kinship, I mean, not all languages make this distinction with relative age. So now I'm going to go look into that before I actually submit this to a journal to double check. Thank you for that, though. It seems natural to me, so that's really what the answer is.
All right, I have a question from Professor Curtis from the chat, who reports it's noisy where she is, so I'm reading it. So related to the diagramming system, Emily says, I'm trying to envision a different tree system that makes this simple. That is, I think, the tree that is in the minds of Tiwa speakers that allows this system to continue. We need other semantics basics of kinship relations. No? She asks.
Right. I mean, I think this relates back to Mata's question about acquisition, because I mean, well, this part of the system's easy to remember. It's like every other language except with relative age. It's this part of the system that you've got to wonder about just in terms of how it persists over time. I think it's just that these distinctions are culturally relevant. I think that's what it comes down to. And so they're more salient to people. And so if you always have to refer to them, then I guess it makes sense that, if you really have this conceptual distinction between my in-clan parents' siblings and my out-of-clan parents' siblings, then that becomes relevant. Yeah, that's interesting though. I mean, languages have some pretty complex stuff that they manage to persist in having over many, many decades. As for how it's represented in the minds of speakers, I have no idea. We need a cognitive linguist to help us with that. Oh, right. And then also why the same term for different relations. So I think the Pohari one, this daughter-in-law and wife of younger brother makes sense. Just in the sense of maybe how the family dynamics work, but also they're both in different politeness relationships. So the politeness matches up in that case. For the Ayong one, I have absolutely no idea why it's the same. This is the puzzling one for me.
If we have time, I can squeeze one more in, Jenny, about the cool, which you said could follow up on about the inherited from your mother and father, and that depends on circumstances. Could you elaborate a little bit on what those circumstances might be?
Yeah, so I'm really lucky that an anthropologist decided to write about this because I didn't know what was going on for the longest time. So Tiwa is an ambilineal system. So matrilineal systems, inheritance is through the mother's side, patrilineal through the father's side. Ambilineal systems, it can be through either. And in Tiwa, the way it's decided is based on which house you were born into. So in particular, when two people get married, one of them goes to live with the other person's family. In, I think, most societies, it's always kind of fixed, like the woman goes to live with the man's family or vice versa, right? as far as I can tell, at least historically. In Tiwa, there's no restriction. I think it just comes down to practicality, like who has more space, which family's richer, all this other stuff. So sometimes the man will go live with the woman's family. And in that case, the children will inherit the woman's clan because they're born into her family's ancestral home. But if the woman goes and lives with the man's family, it's the other way around. The children will inherit the man's, the father's clan because they are born into the father's ancestral home. I'm so glad I read that book by Ramirez because this had been bugging me for a while. I thought it used to be a matrilineal system and then was switching due to contact with Assamese culture, perhaps. But it turns out this is actually a very stable system that's existed like this for a very long time. And that in itself is also very rare. And none of the other languages it's related to do this. They're split between matrilineal and patrilineal. So super cool.
Very interesting. Thanks. All right. Anybody have, we're a little after 5. Any last minute questions?
I have one.
Go ahead.
So I was hung up on one of the kinship terms. I believe especially ku mamai or mamahor. You point out how it's a combination of existing kinship terms. Do you know where that might come from? Or the logic, the cultural logic behind that, or other terms that are formed like this?
Yeah, I think it's just this term. So I think it makes sense that it's formed like this because it's like the mamai is the in-clan uncle word, and then the hu is the in-law word. So it's like just you put those two things together, and this is the result you get. As for why this particular relation has that way of referring to them, that's a big question, and I'm not sure of what the answer to that is. One thing to note, though, the term mamai and mamahur and a bunch of these terms are actually borrowed from Assamese a long time ago. So you see, like the word mamai is used in Assamese in a very different sense. I think it has to be matrilineal uncle. So it's very different. But I think for some reason, this relationship does really matter, this hu mamai and a male ego, because there is the group kin term that would refer to that set of people too. So I need an anthropologist to come work full time with me. That is, I think, the conclusion of a lot of this. Cool. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm going to start sending up the applause for Ginny. So add yours, virtual or actual. And thank you so much. Very interesting talk. And I'm glad that it's recorded so that other people can watch it who weren't able to join us today, and we'll let you all know where it will be uploaded after we've taken a look at it. So thanks again, Ginny. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you so much for listening to me talk about all that information.